Ladies and gentlemen, I am happy to welcome you all on the second day of the Hamdan Global Forum for Excellence. In today's session, I am honored to present to you Mr. Carlos Vargas, Chief of Section for Teacher Development at UNESCO and Head of the Secretariat of International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. Mr. Carlos is specialized in global education policy. His research and publications focus on the relationship between education, human rights, and well-being, the orientations and discourses of public policy and their effects on society. Mr. Carlos has worked for universities, civil society, international organizations, and local governments in Latin America and Europe, both implementing lifelong learning policies and analyzing their intersection with equity, inclusion, and social justice. Since 2015, he works for UNESCO, where he has coordinated research on the social relevance and cultural relevance of education in 5 continents. And now, I will leave you to attend the session. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. Thank you very much for the invitation to present in the Hamdan Global Forum for Excellence, organized by the Hamdan bin Rashid Al Maktoum Foundation for Distinguished Academic Performance. My name is Carlos Vargas, and I lead the section for teacher development at UNESCO and the Secretariat of the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. It is a pleasure to be with you, even if at a distance, and to share with you what are some of the challenges and some of the commitments that came out of the Transforming Education Summit in last September. As you know, it was convened by the UN Secretary General, and the purpose was to see how we can transform education. And of course, teachers have a lot to say, and the commitments around supporting the teaching profession were important ones. So allow me to share my screen to share with you what are some of the inputs and some of the challenges that we see ahead for the teaching profession, but also how we trust in the role of teachers to transform education from within. So I will present to you some of the outcomes, some of the lessons that we have learned, not only at the Transforming Education Summit, but also from the recent pandemic of COVID-19, which remind us, of course, that teachers are key to the transformation of education. First of all, let me begin with some lessons that we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. The first lesson I would say, and the most important, is that education can change. No matter how traditional, how conventional, how heavy education systems might be, we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic that they had to change. They had to adapt to new contexts, to new formats. They had to prioritize what was some of the content, sometimes life-saving content regarding how to take care of oneself, of others, of families. And also, as we said, the formats, hybrid education entered in the picture that transform the way we think and we organize education. So one key valuable lesson from the COVID-19 is indeed that education systems can change. And the second lesson I would say is that teachers have the capacity to help enable that change. We saw during the pandemic that teachers actually adapted educational provision to changing demands, not only in terms of format, but also in terms of content, in terms of pedagogies, and that they were able to do that in the most challenging contexts. But for teachers to actually deploy their full potential, they need to be supported, they need to be recognized, and they need to be granted with autonomy and agency to actually make decisions in education, which is something that they don't usually have. UNESCO's recent publication, after the work of the International Commission on the Futures of Education, saw the light in form of a publication that came out in November last year, Reimagining Our Futures Together, which calls for a new social contract for education, one in which teachers are at the center of this transformation. Now, we heard that this key role of teachers in the transformation of education throughout the process of the Transforming Education Summit. As you might be aware, we had a pre-summit event in Paris, and the teacher task force was represented by the Hamdan Foundation at the summit, both in Paris, the pre-summit in June, and the summit of the Transforming Education at the margins of the United Nations General Assembly in New York in last September only. There, we heard the role of teachers. They were present in most national statements of commitments. In the calls for action, there was a confirmation that teachers are paramount for the transformation of education. However, and throughout the summit and the background paper that we prepared for the summit, we signaled the fact that we do not have enough teachers to achieve SDG 4. So there simply are not enough teachers in the world if we want to ensure universal primary and secondary education. And this problem is compounded as well by attrition and by retainment challenges. Teachers are leaving the profession. Sometimes within the first 5 years, teachers turn to other more attractive, more appealing professions, ones probably with better working conditions. As we've seen, teachers don't always have the best working conditions. There are issues regarding workloads, which increased during the pandemic in terms of shifts, in terms of the time that they needed to prepare for class, to connect, to grade, and so on. But there are also all the issues that have to do with the remuneration that teachers actually perceive. The contractual conditions are not the most conducive, they're not the most appealing. We're not attractive new talents to the profession because of low payment and remuneration. But beyond the contractual situation, beyond the remuneration, we see that teachers leave the profession even in places where they are actually properly compensated. And this has to do with an issue of trust, with an issue of trusting teachers to actually be able to lead the change, to make decisions, for example, in the classroom, to make curricular adjustments, to have a say in terms of educational assessment. So we do see also that when teachers are told what to teach, when to teach, how to do it, and they are supervised, expected, and tested for that which they are supposed to do, instead of improving the innovation that teachers can actually do in terms of instead of forging and fostering creativity, we are curtailing all of the very competencies that we train teachers to have and the very job that teachers are called to perform. One of the challenging reasons also is that there are not enough opportunities for professional development. On the one hand, we have plethora of teachers that do not have the right qualifications to be in the classroom, but also we also see that this professional development is usually central, individualized, top-down, instead of professional development that is social, that is collective, where there is peer learning, where there are communities of practice and collegiality to actually produce knowledge, because teachers actually produce knowledge in their everyday practice. The problem is that this knowledge is not captured, is not systematized, is not shared, not only for the benefit of other teachers, but also for the benefits of education systems. Finally, we see that there is not enough autonomy and decision-making power that is granted to teachers, as we mentioned before. So if we want to transform education, teachers are our best partners, but we need to transform the teaching profession as well. We need to transform how we think of teachers, how we compensate them, how we recruit them, how we professionalize them. And this is something that I wanted to share with you, not only the challenges that we see, and what I'm going to present next paints a picture of what are some of these challenges, but also what is the way forward. What are some of the policy solutions that we can envision to advance the teaching profession globally? So as we said, one of the main challenges has to do with teacher shortages. So there are gaps, as you have seen. In sub-Saharan Africa, we need another 16 million and a half teachers to ensure universal primary and secondary education. In Southern Asia, we're talking about 7 million. In Latin America and the Caribbean, recent estimates of the Inter-American Development Bank put the figure at 10 million teachers. But this is not only a problem of the South. We see in Europe and North America, a lot of countries are struggling with teacher gaps, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been many teachers that left the profession that have not come back, sometimes because of fear of the pandemic, but sometimes because of, as we said, the workloads multiplied. We also have teachers that are going into retirement, and the teachers that are age 58 years old or more are or account for the 40% of teachers, for example, in OECD countries. So we do have a lot of teachers going into retirement, and we, as we said before, are not attracting new and talented profiles to replace them. So attrition remains a challenge. Also, we saw teacher absenteeism during the pandemic increased, and this is something that needs to be addressed, together with gender issues. We do see, for example, in early childhood care and education, there's an overrepresentation of women in the profession, but as we go up, this is globally, of course, but as we go up in educational levels, this trend is actually reversed. We see less female teachers going into higher education, the natural sciences, the exact, mathematics, physics, the STEAM or STEM subjects altogether. And also we see less women in leadership positions. So this idea around gender and whose responsibility is the care, the education, the upbringing of children is something that we need to address. Also because there's role models that are created through education, and sometimes we're lacking gender balance when it comes to the teaching workforce. Now, if we go to the next slide, is this, we'll see that the working conditions, as we said, are not the most attractive. Certainly, there's an issue with salaries. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, they have been declining since 2000 relatively to the gross domestic product per capita. And we also see that there are some alternative types of contracts, particularly temporary contracts, volunteers, community teachers, maîtres parents, that have actually brought salaries down. Sometimes sometimes countries are trying to make up for the shortages of teachers, bringing in non-qualified teachers who can probably be paid less, but that at the end of the day, it's a temporary solution that is not sustainable. As we said, in terms of salaries, 60% of the countries in the world pay primary teachers less than other professions that require similar qualifications. So that, of course, speaks of the competitiveness of the teacher profession and amounts to some of the challenges that we have. We see primary teachers, for example, in countries in sub-Saharan Africa that earn a fraction, sometimes 10% of what other teachers do in Western Europe or North America, for example. Summing or adding up to these working conditions, we see also a high pupil-teacher ratio. On average, we see 55 to 1 trained teacher in sub-Saharan Africa, which is twice as large as the proportion of teachers per, of students per teacher in the world. We see high workloads and teaching hours, which leaves very little time for continuous professional development, for the communities of practice, for teachers to participate in these forms of professional development, of peer learning, because of the high workloads. This has led to burnout because of administrative duties as well. As we said, there's very little time for class preparation, for feedback, even for teacher training, which sometimes has to happen at the expense of the time off, of the holidays, of the leave that teachers might actually have. And finally, in terms of support, we saw that feedback, mentoring, formative assessment, and accompanying teachers in their everyday task is something that is scarce, is something that we don't see often. There's a particular data that came out of the joint survey organized by UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Bank, and OECD earlier this year that revealed that only 50% of countries provided psychosocial support to teachers during the pandemic. Now, as we said, there are challenges in terms of teacher preparation and teacher professional development. And there's a number of teachers, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, but not only, where 31% of primary teachers or almost 40% of secondary teachers do not have the right qualifications to be in the profession. So on the one hand, there's a need for better, more extensive, and more practical initial teacher education, and also for more and continuous forms of professional development. In-service training across the world is much less common in secondary education than it is in primary education. And as we have said, there are large proportion of teachers who are training without the proper qualifications. Also, the qualifications have not adapted lately to some of the current demands in terms, for example, of the digital skills, hybrid teaching and learning, distance education, diversity in the classroom by means of different levels of instruction, multi-grade, multi-level classrooms, and so on. In terms of innovation, we also see a few challenges. As we mentioned before, it's very difficult for teachers to innovate when they are told what to do, when they are inspected, when the curricular guidelines, where the school inspection curtails the creativity and the innovation of teachers. So we need to trust teachers again. We need to trust in their pedagogical judgment. We need to trust in the knowledge that they actually produce and that can be helpful to revamp and to transform education. For that, we need to incentivize creativity, incentivize innovation by means of the stimulus, by means of prices and other mechanisms. Sometimes hand in hand with innovation is the use of technologies and ICTs, but in many countries there's very little support for the digital transformation, beginning with infrastructure. In sub-Saharan Africa, we see, for example, 32% of primary schools have electricity. In Southern Asia, 26% of primary schools and 17% of secondary schools have actually access to internet for pedagogical purposes, while in Latin America, we only see 4 in 10 primary schools have internet for teaching. So we see in those places where there is technology, the digital training that is needed for teachers to use this technology pedagogically is actually low. Just 60% of lower income countries were able to provide training in the use of technologies. Excuse me for a second. Now, what are some of the recommendations in view of those challenges? And here I'm sharing with you some of the recommendations that came out the Transforming Education Summit. First of all, in terms of shortages, we need to implement policies that calculate and cost the needs for the expansion of the teaching workforce. So how many teachers need to be recruited, for example, to achieve SDG 4, all of the targets from universal pre-primary education all the way to secondary, higher education and lifelong. We need to also progressively integrate contract teachers into the public civil service, or at least into recognized and stable forms of employment. We need to promote gender equality in the teaching profession and address gender biases. We need to support women also to take on leadership roles from the school all the way to the policy level. In terms of working conditions, we need to improve the employment and working conditions of teachers by providing social protection, conciliation measures, fair workloads, and allocating time for professional development and for non-teaching activities. If we really want teachers to be reflexive practitioners, to be knowledge producers, we need to give them the time to reflect, and we need to give them the time to produce knowledge. And that can only happen when they are relieved of teaching duty, probably by means of bringing in other teachers and substituting that. And that, of course, requires financial commitments. We need to ensure that teachers have competitive salaries, that they are at least equivalent to those of other professions requiring similar levels of qualifications. And that would actually help the fact that the candidates to enter the teaching profession don't go for other areas, for other disciplines, or once they are in the teaching profession, then they don't leave the field. And it could actually help attract very talented professionals from other professional and disciplinary fields that might become teachers and that might be able to teach, as is sometimes the case. In terms of professional development, one of the recommendations is to develop standards or competency frameworks. This is to say, the agreement, the consensus at social level, that there are a minimum knowledge, skills, competencies, even codes of ethics and codes of conduct that teachers should have if they want to become so. These guidelines, these frameworks, these standards can help, for example, in the recruitment of teachers. They can help to revise the curriculum of teacher initial education. They can inform the continuous professional development of teachers based on this agreement of what teachers need to know and to know how to do. We need to recast teaching as a collaborative profession and reimagine professional development, one that employs, as we said, communities of practice, mentorship programs, and peer-to-peer learning. And finally, if we want teachers to be innovative, we need to foster teacher agency and autonomy, providing incentives for collaboration and innovation, including the use of effective evidence-based pedagogies and technology. We need to finally nurture partnerships for innovation to leverage and stimulate policy practice. Now, in this last slide, in order to reimagine, to recast the teaching profession, what we would say is that we need to rethink education altogether and to put teachers at the center. These are four of the tenets of the Futures of Education report that I was talking about before. So these are four areas of work if we want to transform education in the way we have stated before. The first one is that we need to recast teaching as a collaborative profession and teachers as reflexive practitioners. And this has several implications. If we want to recast thinking as a collaborative profession, it has implications of policy. So policy is done collaboratively in a participatory fashion, listening teachers, listening their perspectives, bringing in different stakeholders. And as we said, also it has implications for professional development. If we want teachers to reflect, they have to do it in collectivity. If we want teachers to leverage their knowledge, they have to do it as well by means of pedagogical communities. This also instills a sense of belonging to a profession, to a professional community, which also is a means for intrinsic motivation. It's a means for the improvement of teacher performance altogether. Secondly, we need to think of teacher development, as we said before, not as a central, individual, top-down, course-based phenomenon, but actually a continuous, lifelong, and life-wide journey. The teachers are always learning, as we are all, but they need to actually bring this learning, to bring this knowledge to the education systems to make transformation. We need to promote public solidarity to transform teaching. And this includes, once again, trusting teachers, but actually granting them the working conditions that they need to fully deploy their talent and their vocation. And one final point is that teachers belong not only in schools. There's a lot that they can do beyond the schools. We need to have teachers as well in educational decision making, as we have said, in public debate, not only around their own working conditions, like the way teachers unions and teacher organizations do, but actually to debate the future of education. The ones that are the best placed, that have the most specific, down-to-earth, close to reality knowledge of the problematics of education, of the needs, the wants and aspirations of learners, is actually teachers. So we need to bring them in to the public debate when we think about transforming education. So I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity. I am very happy to join you online, and I hope and I wish you will have very fruitful discussions in this Hamdan Global Forum for Excellence. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
We thank Mr. Carlos for a great session and valuable information. And I would like to kindly remind you all to attend tomorrow's session delivered by His Excellency Dr. Ahmed Bilhol Al-Filasi, the Minister of Education in UAE. The session will be at 2 p.m. UAE time. Please don't forget to fill the survey to get the certificate of participation. And thank you all for attending. Hope to see you again tomorrow.